Well, welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. We pick up our story in 2 Kings chapter 15. And we're looking at the succession of kings in this chapter, and it speaks to us about the foundations of God's people, both of Israel and Judah, much like the bricks behind me. We think of the foundation of a house, of a building. Is it a solid foundation or is it weak? Well, I think we're seeing here two different perspectives, two different weaknesses, and that'll be revealed as it pushes us to looking at the foundation of the church, Jesus Christ, the cornerstone. Our first king is the king of Judah, who succeeds Amaziah. And this particular king name was Azariah or Uzziah, depending upon whether you're reading the Chronicler in 2 Chronicles or the Book of Kings. It's the same person, the names have a similar meaning, and we're told that during the reign of Jeroboam II of Israel in the north, Azariah became king, and he reigned for 52 years. He had a long and lengthy reign. He was greatly blessed by God materially. He had a large army, extended the borders. He was able to defeat his enemies. And so that the kingdom prospered under his hand, and God gave him a long and victorious reign. But all that was to be, in many ways, swept away by his son, who would follow him, his grandson, who would follow him, but that'll be at a later time. The problem that Uzziah had, that we learn about, is that after all of the success, he became proud. It happens in our lives, that we've seen it before. And so, like his father, he became proud, and he tried to take on to himself the role of a priest. He was struck with leprosy, and then he was banned from the temple precincts and the palace, so that his son, Jotham, would have to govern in his place while King Uzziah was still living. He was buried in Jerusalem, but not buried with the kings because of his leprosy. While that was going on, we have then a succession of the latter kings of Israel to the north. The first king that we note then is Zechariah, who was the great-grandson of Jehu. You remember Jehu, who came to the throne and was tasked by God to remove the household of Ahab and all of his sins. And he was promised by God that his family would reign on the throne of Israel for 4 generations. Well, Zechariah is the 4th generation. And he reigned 6 months. And he followed in the sins of Jeroboam I, of the son of Nebat, and he was killed by one of his men, Shallum. Shallum then killed, as we told, Zechariah, and he reigned in Israel, but he only reigned 1 month. And then he was killed by Menahem. Menahem then reigned in Israel in Shallum's place, and he also followed in the continuing sins of idolatry of Jeroboam, of the son of Nebat. And Pul of Assyria threatened him, and Menahem ended up paying him off with tribute from the treasuries. And Menahem reigned only about 10 years. So in a roughly almost 12-year period, we have at least 3 kings. Then Pekahiah reigns in his place. He's the son of Menahem, and he only gets to reign for 2 years, following again in the sins that were plaguing Israel, and his officer, Pekah, kills him. Pekah then reigned after Pekahiah, and he reigns for 20 years. But he also continues in the sins of Israel and in God's sight. Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria then conquers the territory of Israel, takes people captive, takes certain cities, and Hoshea conspires against him and kills Pekah. And that's the end of chapter 15. So we have all this succession of kings, and we have regicide abounding in the northern kingdom. So let's go back to this idea of a foundation. What do we find? Well, in Israel to the north, it's the foundation of earthly kings. Kings who followed disbelief, idolatry. They were not founded upon God's covenant and God's covenant promises. And we see where that leads us. It leads us to violence, and it leads us to overthrow and instability. It was a weak foundation. And that's the effect of leaving God behind. Now, in the south, with Uzziah, what we find is, of course, an outward prosperity, and we can follow God and follow God's rules, but it seems that Uzziah, as like his father, in a sense, they were measuring themselves by the outward things. We may say religiosity. In other words, his heart was right with the Lord. He did what was right, but was there a real spiritual commitment in the kingdom? There was still the sins that would plague Judah. Now, I'm not judging Uzziah's heart in this sense, but what I am saying is sometimes it's an area of focus. He was blessed by God. He was considered one of the good kings, but materially speaking, he was good. And it doesn't take much, but his grandson, who would follow him, would wipe away all of this. And what it makes us long for is a king who would reign after God's own heart, like David, but better than David, David's greater son. And that, of course, leads us to Christ. The kings and rulers of the world leave us empty, and they leave us in violence and in slavery to sin, and idolatry. We see that in the north. But even God's people who struggle with sin can be too focused on the outward things. And we don't need a sinful man. We need a righteous man. We need a man after God's own heart. We need Jesus, the King, to be our King, who will change our hearts by his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to make us a fit people. And so this life is a life of sanctification. And that leads us, of course, to heaven. And that's the promise of being with Jesus, who has come as the great King. Well, that's good news. Good night.